James Gunn, Peter Safran, and the DCU propels forward with its first official outing, despite having an unofficial outing with Creature Commandos. But Superman is set to kickstart this brand new universe, and in the midst of all that, they're also working behind the scenes to casting and formulating a brand new universe-centric Batman, one that's going to be represented in the animation, in the movies, of course, but also in even, I think to an extent, video games. So while they're trying to find that brand new Batman that is set to, I think, debut with the Brave and the Bold movie, which is being written and directed by Andy Muschietti, and that's not going to be connected to the Pattinson universe, whatever the hell's going on right there. I thought it was also pretty timely that around the same time that Superman is set to come out to kickstart officially the DCU in the much more recognizable mainstream space, we also have the 20th anniversary of the beginning, quite literally in the title, of a brand new Batman after a commercial and critical flop that is Batman and Robin, when Warner Brothers was scrambling around to try to reset everything to make sure that Batman can still stay within the good graces of pop culture as we know it. And they left it onto a filmmaker who had a couple of little critical darlings here and there, one of which garnered an Academy Award nomination for screenplay, Memento, and that is, of course, finding that kindred spirit in the filmmaker, writer, and director Christopher Nolan. And considering that we are hitting the 20-year mark of the release of Batman Begins, thought that this was a perfect opportunity to not only look back at that film and also discuss whether or not it's been buried as a form of underdog within the Dark Knight trilogy, considering how potentially, as much as I love the movie, how possibly overrated the Dark Knight has become. Because everybody, when considering the Dark Knight trilogy, everybody talks about the Dark Knight, the Dark Knight, the Dark Knight. But, you know, we also have to look a little bit at those humble beginnings, there goes that word again, of this Christian Bale, Christopher Nolan team up with the Caped Crusader in the form of Batman Begins. Now, this look is more so just a personal anecdote of rewatching the film, probably for like the fourth or fifth time, because I have seen this movie quite a handful of times. I almost have it pretty much committed to memory. And because of that much more personal perspective, I'm not really going to go into too many divulsions as far as like behind the scenes material in terms of how the making of the movie came about, what the beginnings were. It's so difficult to not say that word. But at the same time, don't look for any kind of like deep dive or hard-hitting journalism as far as like the deconstruction of the making of the film, apart from the fact that Christopher Nolan from the very beginning made it very clear that he genuinely wanted to explore the origins of the character, make it much more of a personal character study on the symbol that is Batman, while at the same time the man behind that legend, Bruce Wayne, and exactly what really makes him tick. And trust me, this movie constantly reminds you that it is in fact an origin story, because I distinctly remember one thing that I was able to pick up on even as a teenager when watching this movie, that Batman, the actual Batman that we know and love, doesn't necessarily show up in the film until an hour in, just a fraction over an hour into the film. Look at the timeline, and there it is. When he finally takes out those goons at the docks, that's an hour and some change into the film. So that bulk of that first opening hour is quite honestly where the part of the begins part of that title really comes in. And it's during that hour where Christopher Nolan makes it clear that one of the things that he really loves about having a hand in the screenplay, which he technically co-wrote, so he wasn't necessarily the sole writer, but you definitely feel a little bit of his print on the way that the story structure is played out here, especially if you are a fan of his prior two, or technically three films that he made right before he took on Batman Begins. And I know a lot of people within the mainstream know those two films are Memento and Insomnia with Al Pacino and Robin Williams. The latter of which is a little bit more straightforward, whereas Memento is not really infamous, but famously known for having a very non-linear structure as far as the way that everything is kind of flashing forward and back and forth. And if you haven't seen the film, I definitely want to keep it vague, because it's a golden nugget of just peeling back those layers, a golden onion, if you will, of trying to extrapolate as much information as possible. Even by the time that you roll credits, you're thinking to yourself, what the hell did I just watch? But in a positive light. However, if you want to throw it back even further, he made a movie, I think in 97 or 98, that's literally just a little over an hour, considering how long Nolan movies are these days. His first film was literally just like an hour and 10 minutes or something like that, called Following, which I have watched, and let's just say, if you just do a quick YouTube search, you can probably find it and literally watch it in its entirety. And I definitely recommend that you do so because it's probably one of the more inspiring things to watch when you think of a powerhouse temple director like Christopher Nolan, and you think about the fact that this guy maximized some credit cards and was only able to film on the weekends to put this little film together. Again, harkening back to those humble beginnings, and I feel like an awful lot of that DNA is definitely still felt untampered with in that opening hour of Batman Begins, where we're cutting back and forth between modern Bruce Wayne trying to get into the League of Shadows, trying to find a way to make peace with his vengeance in the form of a mentorship with Ducard, played by Liam Neeson, and trying to tackle his inner demons, while at the same time, while having, I guess, for lack of a better term, glamorized therapy sessions that then flashes back to the stuff that we know Batman to be. His childhood trauma, his interaction with the bats in the cave, of course the murder of his parents, and even a young adult Bruce who is considerably angry and very dead-faced on trying to get his revenge, only to realize that he was robbed of revenge for a very, very good reason. And admittedly, when I was a teenager, I think this movie came out in 2005, unfortunately, full confession here, didn't watch it in theaters. I had to wait until it came out on DVD and Blu-ray. I don't know why I kind of missed it at the time. Maybe at this part, I was starting to realize how much of a shit show Batman and Robin was, that I was kind of a little burnt out for some reason, and I was kind of leaning more towards making sure that I got my Spider-Man film, waiting on the Spider-Man movies to come out, waiting on the Pirates of the Caribbean movies to come out. I don't know what exactly happened there, but I had to wait until I got the DVD that I finally watched this movie and thought to myself, damn, this thing was legit. But it took a little while to get there because as a teenager, I don't know if it was, like I said, the shorter attention span or the lack of respect, but I found this first hour of the constant flashing back and forth to be a little boring, to be a little bit slower paced, and I didn't really appreciate it the way that I probably should have. If I could go back in time, I would most definitely slap 14-year-old me upside the head, because now, as an adult, I have a much more profound respect for the way that this movie takes its time to deconstruct the character. That way, when we get to the point of the sequels, it's a little easier to digest when we don't really have Batman be the main character in his own sequels. Let's admit it, The Dark Knight Rises are really the Joker and Bane show when it really boils down to it, and Batman kind of almost becomes a secondary character, but there's a legitimately good reason, because he is, from beginning to end, the main character in Batman Begins, especially during this first hour where it's just constantly flashing back and flashing forward, to have Bruce have these like inner monologues, or rather outer monologues, because most of the time he's talking to another character, talking about what it is exactly that's making him so angry, why it is that he's so conflicted, how much of a profound effect his parents' murders really had, and how it kind of just ripples into becoming an allegory for the state that Gotham is in, and why it is that he needs to be better out of all people. And now 20 years later, I respect that approach. I'm able to absorb exactly what Nolan was intending for this first hour to be. And we also get a glimpse at those trademarks, like I said, the non-linear structure of the writing, but also very, huge staples for the trilogy that are now kind of synonymous with Nolan's storytelling. To me, one of the things that has aged like fine wine, not just for Batman Begins, but also for across the trilogy, was not having a title, having the very simplistic opening of just the bat symbol in some way, shape, or form that ties to the theme of the film. Here, because it is Batman Begins, you see the formation of bats forming the bat symbol very, very subtly into the bright orange sunsetty sky there at the beginning of the film. And then, of course, as it propels forward, we get the Dark Knight with just a blue fiery blaze forming a crevice inside that then shapes into the bat symbol, representing the archaic nature of the Joker. And then we have some form of ice or glass breaking in the Dark Knight Rises, obviously for the destruction that Bane is going to cause on Bruce's body and his spirit. That then gives him an excuse to then punctuate the film, or all three films, with the actual title of the movie at the very, very end. Almost like a thank you for coming, thank you for sticking around all this time and investing in the story. Here's the title. I don't know, for some reason it feels earned. I don't know if that's just me being a goddamn nerd, but I just love the fact that we don't get a title at the beginning. We get a symbol to kind of just light the fuse in some respect. I just saw Mission Impossible, so that's kind of in my mind a little bit. But also to, like I said, kind of bring things full circle and still make the films feel complete despite being part of a trilogy. We have the titles finally showing up at the end in a very splash screen sort of way, like, bam, it's over, thank you for coming, and it feels complete. It feels satisfactory. It was also in Batman Begins where we would see an awful lot of archetypal, technical aspects of not only the trilogy, but also subsequently an awful lot of Nolan's films going forward. Even though there's been some evolutions and developments and kind of swaps as far as some of those frequent collaborators. So obviously here we finally get Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan meeting and forming a very, very lengthy partnership, because prior to this, I think it was David Julian was his most frequent composer. I think that was his name. But then here it was just the rest was history. This was the first collaboration with Hans Zimmer, and for a really long time there, they collaborated up until Hans Zimmer was tapped by Denis Villeneuve, if that's how you pronounce his last name, to take on Dune, and that's kind of what things kind of segmented and had Nolan find Ludwig Göransson. But aside from the collaboration with Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, who I think is still very, oh my god, talk about one of the biggest snubs, one of the biggest like slanders and sleep-ons as far as the music department in the film industry is James Newton Howard. This guy's been nominated, I think, for like 8 or 9 or maybe even 10 Oscars and has not won a single goddamn statue. And I feel like maybe somewhere in there it should have been the first 2 Dark Knight films, Dark Knight and Batman Begins. And you can still hear his influence in the score here, and you see an awful lot of, like I said, humble beginnings of all their different department heads. Nathan Crowley constructing the production design behind Arkham and the rest of Gotham City, Wally Feister being able to do the cinematography that the Nolan trilogy was known for, so many other people that were then collaborating in a way that makes things very signature, especially Nolan's penchant for on-location shooting, especially the way that this movie opens up with the Himalayas and all of these different helicopter and crane shots that make it abundantly clear that they went to this place without the use for any kind of green screenery or CGI, and also practical effects, from the blowing up of that monastery to other things that are happening in Gotham City, to the immaculate casting that Nolan is able to balance all these different, very huge names and still making them all feel completely natural and at home here. There's definitely no mistaking that after American Psycho, there was a very clear reason as to why Christian Bale was cast as Bruce Wayne Batman. It was practically right there. He was the face for it. And I can definitely see, even after 20 years later, that this was no casting mistake. That, Nolan, along with his casting director, his wife/producer, Emma Thomas, they all had very clear visions of who Bruce Wayne needed to be, and they hit a complete, in my opinion, they hit a home run with Christian Bale as far as portraying Bruce. I know that his Batman is still a little divisive, and I completely understand that. Why? I like his visual embodiment of the character. I will admit, I don't think his voice has aged all that well 20 years later. There's a reason for why it's constantly being parodied, because it was like the kids like to say these days, it was a choice. It was definitely one of the choices of all time. And one consensus that I will submit to is that it's not necessarily the best Batman voice. There's arguably much better Batman voices that have appeared before then and since then. Hell, I'll take Kilmer's voice over that of Christian Bale's. But I feel like he nailed Bruce Wayne as far as, like I said, the way that Nolan intended to deconstruct the character, peel him apart, break him apart, and then build him back up, so that when he takes on the actual suit and becomes Batman, and now we're into this movie, you can understand why, and it fits naturally. It doesn't feel like a sudden switch up. But then combining everybody else who's just at the top of their game here and just fits into the role like a glove. Of course, the shoulder to lean on and get picked up on after falling. It's one of the themes of the movie. Michael Caine as Alfred. Of course, the reliable Sergeant, who's not even a lieutenant yet, Sergeant Gordon, played by Gary Oldman. Like I said, that is just peak casting. But then everybody else, Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox, Cillian Murphy, who before giving us the Oppenheimer face, he was a younger set actor who I think is only real. He's been in a handful of films prior to Batman Begins, but the one that mainly people knew him from, of course, was 28 Days Later. So he was a good fitting for Scarecrow. Albert, I feel like his character was a little bit subsided as the movie went along. He integrated into the plot very naturally at the beginning, but towards the end, I can most definitely agree with other people that one of the things that didn't really age well is just how cucked Scarecrow really gets towards the end of this film, despite looking legitimately awesome with that flaming horse. But the way that he goes out, I will admit that probably could have still 20 years later could have been done better. But then you got Tom Wilkinson. I keep forgetting that Tom Wilkinson was in this movie as the Carmine Falcone, and he is or Falcone, however you pronounce it. He is also perfect. I feel like more people need to talk about his performance because you definitely feel his presence whenever he's on screen. He owns the screen whenever he's around, to the point where even I'm like, if he asked me to like be part of his gang, he would make him very, even outside of the violence and the extortion and the blackmail, I can find a compelling, persuasion as to why it is that I should be in cahoots with him. He is just that charismatic of a Carmine Falcone in this, and I feel like not enough people are talking about him to this day, along with, of course, the one and only Liam Neeson as Ducard / Ra's al Ghul. That's the one thing that this new recent rewatch did make me kind of put into perspective, is the way that this movie tackles the concept of Ra's al Ghul. Now, unfortunately, most of the cast is great, but there's a couple of outliers. Let's be honest, one outlier, to be quite honest and frank, and that is Katie Holmes as Rachel Dawes. And yeah, she's definitely the weak link. But hindsight being 2020, and after doing this newest rewatch, it's weird because I know that Nolan has been criticized for not having the strongest female characters in his film. But recently we had Emily Blunt and Florence Pugh in Oppenheimer. Carrie-Anne Moss in Memento, she was great. Anne Hathaway in Interstellar. There's actually a good chunk of really great female characters that I'm able to see in the gray area, have a debate and discussion about, kind of come at it from different angles. Katie Holmes, like I said, there's certain scenes where she's okay, she's fine, and then there's others where I'm like, damn, we could have used a second take of that delivery. God damn, what exactly happened there? And hindsight being 2020, we also have to remind ourselves that this is 2005 Katie Holmes. 2005 Katie Holmes, who was dealing with some stuff, specifically a certain someone. And 2005 Katie Holmes, you couldn't go to the grocery store and not see 2005 Katie Holmes on the tabloids. So, to be a little empathetic, there's probably a reason for why it is that she was probably mentally preoccupied. Let's put it that way. And yes, I'll be using Katie Holmes' performance in this film, which unfortunately did garner a Razzie nomination for Worst Supporting Actress, as probably the catalyst for the things that I will admit did not age terrifically well from Batman Begins. It's actually something that may or may not have aged, even progressing in the Dark Knight trilogy, and even in some action-oriented films like Tenet and Inception, where Christopher Nolan, as much as high concept as he is, and as much as of a prolific filmmaker he has become with his writing, his directing, his respect for the filmmaking art, he hasn't necessarily evolved as an action director. There's times where I truly do feel like his action is still talked about and debated about to this day. And you can see some of those seeds being planted with Batman Begins, where we have some background material and some behind the scenes footage showcasing the choreographers and how they were trying to articulate and formulate a brand new fighting style for Bruce Wayne to take on, that's like a combination of jiu-jitsu and Krav Maga and all this different stuff. I don't know the intricacies and details about the fighting style, but I just know that they were trying to create something new for him so that he felt like his own character, his own fighter. And it's a shame to see that all that hard work was retroactively kind of wiped by the shoddy editing. The editing when it comes to like dialogue, and also one of the staples that Nolan is known for, cross-cutting, which you see the seed of that being planted here, which I thoroughly do really, really love. I love it when Nolan cross-cuts, when we have like different situations happening. It kind of rises the tension. It kind of builds on something that just crescendos into, like I said, chaos, something that is done very effectively, almost immaculate in The Dark Knight. And you can see the foundations, the beginnings, I can't use that word, of that happening here in Batman Begins. But it's just a shame that a little bit of that editing goes a little over the top when it comes to the fighting, to where I'm like, I literally just saw a hand and a fist and a foot go like this, and the guy's down. Yeah, you see that from the beginning when he's in prison, to the middle when he's training, to when he's taking on those dudes at the shipping docks, and then towards his climax fight with Liam Neeson's character. And I am just going to kick back and just accept the end result of what I just witnessed visually on screen. But like I mentioned before, it gave birth to a little bit of that cross-cutting technique that Nolan is known for building tension, for building suspense, for getting the momentum, considering moving forward, especially with some of his longer films, to the point where I think recently he even did an interview where he enjoys cutting movies, even some of his longer films, like trailers, to have like that trailer momentum of building in a musical fashion. And to an extent, that can work in favors like Oppenheimer to make a very girthy 3-hour film feel a bit more brisk and not as, slow paced and molasses like as it could have potentially been in the hands of another director or even editor. And on top of that, it leads to some of my favorite moments in Batman Begins, one of which happens just before we hit the hour mark, which is Bruce finally coming back to Gotham, getting the gadgets, building the Batcave, acquiring the Batmobile, looking at all these different aspects of building the mythology, building the symbol that is Batman, and again, having an awful lot of that cross-cutting. It's just so satisfying to watch on screen. Which then finally brings us to Batman being born in that hour, and we get the Batsuit, which, in my opinion, has become a bit of an underrated Batsuit. It's a shame that this Batsuit has been buried for quite an awful long time, and it's great to see that's getting some mad respects on the 20-year anniversary, because whenever any kind of marketing material is made for the Dark Knight trilogy as a whole, all 3 films, it's always the suit from the Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises. Whenever there's a figure, whenever there's a lunchbox, whenever there's a shirt, okay, maybe not this one, but whenever something that is meant to market this entire legacy of films, it's always the Dark Knight suit and never Batman Begins. So it's good to see that this suit, which I personally do feel is underrated, I don't know if it's like better. I have yet to formulate a proper preference as far as which 2 suits I prefer, but there's something very legitimately animalistic and intimidating about watching this guy wearing this suit just hovering there in the corner. You legit get kind of scared with the big, sculpted ears at the top right here that then kind of morph and meld into the rest of his actual neck and head. It looks much more monstrous than a dude in a tactical suit, which just happens to have a bit of a helmet that can turn with the little ears. I do argue that there's facets about the suit that work in favor of the intimidating nature that Batman is trying to strike fear into criminals' hearts, and that suit is able to carry that a little bit more. You got the velvety cape, you have the buckles right here, the symbol on the chest, in my opinion, looks a bit more like a bat symbol as opposed to just having the logo on the front 2 plates of the Dark Knight suit. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I feel like I might be preferring the Batman Begins. And like I mentioned before, it's glad to see that companies are finally appreciating it and giving it much more love in 2025 with the likes of McFarlane Toys. Maybe Hot Toys will finally deliver on a 2.0. Hopefully we'll get some announcements of some prosumer companies like Mayfix and Figuarts doing something. And to a certain extent, I can also give that same sort of recognition to the Batmobile, the Tumbler itself as well. Because, bit of a hot take here, I think Batman Begins has the best chase scene with the Tumbler, more so than even whatever we saw with the camel tumblers and the Batwing, the bat in The Dark Knight Rises, and even that under freeway chase scene with both the Tumbler and the Batpod in The Dark Knight. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the way that it's kind of composed to Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard's music, or the momentum of the editing. There's just something just so satisfying and rewatchable about the chase scene with the Tumbler here in Batman Begins that I prefer, more so than the other 2 films. Again, like I said, it's like the momentum. I just like rewatching the scene over and over. And it's good to see that, like I said, companies respect the Tumbler. You have Jazz Inc. recently talking about doing their 1/6 scale, albeit just a tad bit overpriced, but going for a much more affordable option. Again, some more recognition from some of these high-tier, high-caliber collectible companies. We have Hot Toys giving us a 2.0 of Scarecrow, Cillian Murphy's Scarecrow, complete with a head sculpt likeness of him, the burlap sack version, some effects, which then leads to something that is also a secret weapon of Batman Begins that it arguably and almost objectively has over the latter 2 films. You almost can't contest this, and that is the horror element, of which is very, very likely attributed to co-writer and co-story creator David S. Goyer, who is notably absent from the last 2 films, who don't have that horror aesthetic, and that's something that I just profoundly appreciate about Batman Begins 20 years later, and I feel it needs to be studied upon a little bit more further, especially when considering our brand new Batman for the DCU is that horror element, that gothic element that Batman Begins was able to harness that likely David S. Goyer was able to incorporate with his contributions to the writing. Of course, his Scarecrow himself, just by himself as a concept with his drugs and the hallucinogenic and all that stuff, just speaks for itself. But the actual way that those drugs are interpreted on screen with the disturbing imagery, the bat coming out of his mouth, and then of course Demon Bat when he finally turns the tables on Scarecrow, I mean, that's just iconic. You see that image and you think instantly Batman Begins. Again, shout out to McFarlane for making an actual McFarlane figure out of that. I do think that Hot Toys, despite having given us a prior Demon Bat in a 1.0 like 2-pack with the Scarecrow, because you gave Scarecrow 2.0, I think Demon Batman needs his own 2.0 as well, and I'm hoping that other companies will follow suit. But on top of that, you have so many other things within the aesthetic nature of Batman Begins that just speak to the horror, from the inclusion of Victor Zsasz, who's like a serial killer and cuts himself every time that he kills somebody at like a tally mark, and I feel I really partially wish that they would have explored that a little bit more in this film as opposed to just being a side character, of which the game is able to do him a little better justice than even the movie was able to do. That's one of the things that I actually did appreciate more about the PS2 movie tie-in games, that Zsasz, it feels much more monstrous and elaborated on than even he is in this film. But then on top of that, the actual intimidating nature of the Narrows, feeling very grimy, gross, being in the Narrows, feeling like a legitimate Gotham City instead of just Chicago, like the sequels would do. But then we're snapped back slightly to reality that this was in fact shot in Chicago when we come back to this climax that then solves the mystery, brings everything full circle as far as Ra's al Ghul / Ducard being in charge of this whole operation, him stealing the emitter, trying to poison Gotham, destroy it from the inside out. But at least to me, the big takeaway is knowing that this is truly where Batman, like the title says, begins. Gotham knows about him, Gordon knows about him, allies are formed, but also bridges are burned, metaphorically, before they become literally burned in Dark Knight Rises, which then brings this whole story a little bit much more full circle than I think was originally intended. But at the very least, there's something just so satisfyingly looped back around with this ending that it makes it very clear what Christopher Nolan was setting out to do, which is to establish Batman, bring his arc to a close. Because if you really think about it, the evolution of Batman as a character and Bruce Wayne's character, his whole journey to becoming the Dark Knight, from a spiritual and emotional state, really does end with Batman Begins. After that, it's really more so on the technical aspects of evolving the suit, you know, upgrading his arsenal, getting new toys, things like that, and trying to figure out new methods to take on some of the much more harsher enemies, much more aggressive enemies that he was going to take on in the forms of Joker and Bane and his army. Apart from that, he really doesn't really grow that much of a character, which I guess you can then kind of bottle into becoming a form of complaint or criticism towards the sequels. But we'll get to those when we finally get to those anniversary retrospective deep dives. For now, it's very satisfying to see that we do get a true beginning, middle, and end for Bruce's journey to becoming the Dark Knight at the very end of Batman Begins, that is punctuated by probably one of the best endings to give a Batman film, which is finally earning earning a literal and metaphorical symbol in the form of the bat signal, with a legit actual plate. And sure, it's played up for a gag, like, I couldn't find more mob bosses, but I feel like there's much more under the surface of actually giving Batman his own bat signal at the end of the movie, is to signify that Batman is here to stay. But that could also be a problem. Like Gordon mentions, what about escalation? You're, very super fantastical with this bat suit and this crazy weaponry. Who's to say that some guy is not gonna, commit full-blown acts of terrorism wearing clown makeup, leading to, I'm sorry, objectively one of the best sequel teases that we get in modern cinema. And that's why 20 years later, despite its legitimate problems, Batman Begins is probably the most underrated film out of the Dark Knight trilogy. What do you guys think about Batman Begins 20 years later? Both pros, cons, and everything else in between. I still love this film. In fact, I prefer it over Dark Knight Rises. Yes, Dark Knight is still a better film, but I feel like in the year of our Lord 2025, we gotta pay Batman Begins a fair share of its dues. Whatever you guys have to say, I'm looking forward to reading it down in the comment section. While you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this retrospective. Thumbs down if you did not. And as always, stay humble, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.